Imagine a nation teetering on the brink of collapse once again. The scars of the First Civil War, a bloody conflict that had torn the United States apart, were still fresh. It's 1876, and whispers of a second Civil War are spreading like wildfire. The country, still deeply divided by race, politics, and power, stands on the edge of chaos. But what would have pushed America into another civil conflict only a decade after the end of the first one? In 1876, the U.S. was facing an unprecedented crisis. A bitterly contested presidential election, racial tensions, and the failure of Reconstruction left the nation more divided than ever. The country's internal struggles were as fraught with tension as those that had led to the First Civil War. But did the events of 1876 really push America to the point of another civil war? Let us explore the political landscape and the deep divisions that threatened to tear the country apart once again. The struggle for Reconstruction. The Reconstruction era, which began immediately after the Civil War, was supposed to heal the nation's wounds. However, by 1876, it was clear that Reconstruction had failed to bring true peace or unity. The South had been devastated by the war, and efforts to rebuild the region were met with fierce resistance. The Freedmen's Bureau, established to assist newly freed African Americans, was under constant attack by Southern whites who sought to maintain their power and control. African Americans in the South were facing severe discrimination, and the newly established Reconstruction governments struggled to assert authority over the region. The South was dominated by a mix of former Confederates and new Republican-led governments, with tensions running high. Many Southerners viewed the Reconstruction efforts as a Northern imposition, while Northern Republicans were determined to secure civil rights for former slaves. This political stalemate created an atmosphere of unrest, with many fearing that another war could erupt if the status quo persisted. The election of 1876. The most immediate trigger for the crisis of 1876 was the presidential election, which pitted Republican Rutherford B. Hayes against Democrat Samuel J. Tilden. The election was marred by widespread fraud, voter suppression, and allegations of corruption on both sides. The outcome of the election was in doubt for weeks, and both parties claimed victory. Tensions were high as the country waited for a resolution, and many feared that the disputed election could lead to violent confrontations. The result of the election hinged on the electoral votes from 4 southern states: Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon. Both Tilden and Hayes claimed victory in these states, and the situation quickly escalated into a political crisis. The southern states, which had been the heart of the Confederacy, were once again at the center of a political battle that could have ignited violence. If the election had been left unresolved, the country might have been plunged into another conflict, with the South threatening to break away once again. The Compromise of 1877. In the end, the crisis was resolved not through warfare, but through the Compromise of 1877. The Electoral Commission, made up of representatives from both parties, decided to award the disputed electoral votes to Rutherford B. Hayes, making him the winner of the election. In exchange for this concession, Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. This compromise marked the end of efforts to protect the rights of African Americans in the South and led to the rise of the Jim Crow laws, which institutionalized racial segregation and disenfranchised African Americans for decades. The Compromise of 1877 brought an end to the immediate threat of another civil war, but it also highlighted the deep divisions in American society. The South had effectively regained control over its own affairs, and racial tensions remained high. Many African Americans were left without protection, and the political system was once again dominated by the interests of white Southerners. While violence did not erupt, the legacy of the events of 1876 would continue to shape American politics and society for years to come. The aftermath of the 1876 presidential election and the resulting Compromise of 1877 had far-reaching consequences that reshaped the future of the United States. Though the immediate risk of another civil war was averted, the resolution of the election marked the end of the Reconstruction era and left the country deeply divided along racial and political lines. While the compromise successfully brought Rutherford B. Hayes into office, and it came at a heavy price, one that would set the stage for racial segregation, disenfranchisement, and systemic inequality that would persist for nearly a century. With the removal of federal troops from the South was effectively left to its own devices. The Reconstruction governments that had been established by the federal government to protect the rights of freedmen were dismantled, and power was returned to the former Confederates and white Southerners. The collapse of Reconstruction. The collapse of Reconstruction left African Americans in the South without meaningful protection from the state or the federal government. Though the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments had guaranteed freedom, citizenship, and voting rights to African Americans, these legal rights were now undermined by the very people who had fought to maintain the institution of slavery. The withdrawal of federal troops allowed the return of Southern Democrats to power, and with them, the implementation of policies that would strip African Americans of their hard-won freedoms. Southern states quickly passed black codes, laws that severely limited the rights and freedoms of African Americans. These laws, while not outright slavery, effectively kept African Americans in a subjugated position, forcing them into labor contracts that were often exploitative and reminiscent of slavery. They were also disenfranchised by legal loopholes, poll taxes, and literacy tests, which effectively stripped them of the right to vote. Despite the 15th Amendment's guarantees, one of the most significant consequences of the Compromise of 1877 was the rise of the Jim Crow system in the South. In the years following Reconstruction, the Southern states began enacting racial segregation laws that institutionalized the separation of black and white Americans in almost every aspect of life. Public transportation, schools, restaurants, and even public restrooms were segregated, and African Americans were denied access to many public services and opportunities. The system of racial segregation would remain entrenched for decades, particularly in the South, white supremacy, and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. The power vacuum left by the end of Reconstruction also facilitated the rise of white supremacist groups, the most infamous of which was the Ku Klux Klan, KKK. Formed in the late 1860s, the Klan quickly grew in power, and by the time the Compromise of 1877 was enacted, it had become a potent force for terror and intimidation in the South. The Klan's primary goal was to suppress African American voting and prevent them from gaining political power. The Klan, along with other white supremacist groups, engaged in widespread violence against African Americans. This included lynchings, beatings, and other forms of physical intimidation. The violence was intended to instill fear and maintain control over the black population. Despite the efforts of the federal government to curb Klan violence during Reconstruction, the withdrawal of federal troops made it difficult for the government to enforce the laws that protected African Americans. The Klan flourished in this environment of lawlessness and political impotence, striking fear into African American communities across the South. The end of Reconstruction and the rise of white supremacy marked the beginning of nearly a century of racial violence and political disenfranchisement. African Americans in the South were left to struggle for survival in a system that was designed to keep them in a subjugated state. The economic divide and political frustration. Beyond the racial and political divisions, the economic landscape of the United States in 1876 was deeply unstable. The South had been economically devastated by the Civil War, and while the Northern economy was thriving, the South remained impoverished. The end of Reconstruction meant that the federal government would not be involved in rebuilding the Southern economy, leaving the region to fend for itself. This created a significant divide between the North and South in terms of economic power and resources. The Southern economy was still largely agrarian and dependent on the labor of African Americans, most of whom were working on sharecropping farms under exploitative conditions. Sharecropping, which involved renting land in exchange for a portion of the crops produced, became a new form of economic servitude for African Americans. Though legally free, many former slaves found themselves trapped in a cycle of debt and poverty. Landowners took advantage of this system, ensuring that African Americans remained bound to the land without real economic mobility. At the same time, the North was undergoing rapid industrialization. Railroads, factories, and the growth of large urban centers made the North economically powerful, while the South remained mired in agricultural stagnation. The political tension between the two regions deepened, with the South feeling marginalized by the federal government's lack of support, and the North feeling frustrated by the South's intransigence on racial issues. A nation divided. The Compromise of 1877 did not restore unity. Rather, it marked a deepening of the political, social, and racial divides that had existed since the Civil War. While violence did not break out immediately, the threat of future conflict remained. The two regions, North and South, were more ideologically and economically divided than ever. The South was governed by Democrats who were determined to maintain white supremacy, while the North was increasingly controlled by Republicans who sought to secure civil rights for African Americans. In the years following the Compromise, political animosity between the two regions continued to grow. The Republican Party, which had championed the cause of Reconstruction, became more focused on national economic issues, while the Democratic Party, which had retaken control of the South, grew more committed to defending the racial status quo. By the time the 20th century arrived, the political landscape of the United States had been forever changed by the events of 1876. The failures of Reconstruction and the Compromise of 1877 created a legacy of racial inequality and division that would take generations to address. The events of 1876 left African Americans in a precarious position, politically and socially, and the fight for civil rights would continue to define American history well into the 1960s. Racial segregation and the civil rights struggle, the civil rights movement, which gained momentum in the 20th century, was in many ways a direct response to the failures of Reconstruction and the aftermath of the 1876 election. The segregation and disenfranchisement that followed the Compromise of 1877 would fuel decades of activism, from the early battles for voting rights to the landmark civil rights legislation of the 1960s. The legacy of 1876, in which the country avoided war but failed to resolve its racial divisions, cast a long shadow over the nation's history. African Americans in the South were subjected to a system of second-class citizenship that endured for nearly 100 years. The fight for civil rights would continue through the mid-20th century, culminating in major victories such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These victories, however, were hard-won, and the struggle for racial equality would remain a central issue in American society. The United States came close to a second civil war in 1876, but the country avoided bloodshed through political compromise. However, the events of 1876 did not resolve the deeper divisions in American society. The failure to address racial inequality, political corruption, and economic disparity laid the foundation for decades of conflict, resistance, and social upheaval. While the nation did not descend into another civil war, the unresolved issues of race and power continued to shape American politics and society for generations. The legacy of 1876 remains a stark reminder of how fragile peace can be in a deeply divided nation.